Maggie Sullivan's hand stopped shaking the day she stopped feeling. 3 years of war had taught her that lesson in blood and morphine. She could saw through shattered bone without flinching, hold intestines inside soldiers barely old enough to shave, watch men die calling for mothers who would never know their final words. The trick was simple. Don't see them as human. See them as problems to solve, puzzles of flesh and blood that either fit together or didn't. It worked perfectly until July 17, 1945, when she examined prisoner number 27 and remembered what it meant to break. The camp sprawled across the southern end of Okinawa, like a wound that refused to heal. Canvas tents stretched in precise military rows, separated by mud channels that turned to soup when the afternoon rains came. The smell hit you first. Unwashed bodies, latrine trenches, disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying rot. Maggie had learned to breathe through her mouth during her first week at Guadalcanal. Now she didn't notice anymore. She reported to the medical tent at 0600, same as every morning since the island was secured. Major Betty Crawford was already there, gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, reviewing supply manifests with the kind of intensity most people reserved for religious texts. Sullivan. Crawford didn't look up. We've got 40 Japanese females who came in last night. Picked up near the Shuri Line remnants. Command wants them processed before they're transferred to the main detention facility in Guam. Maggie poured herself coffee from the perpetually burning pot. It tasted like diesel and regret. What's their status? Identified as medical support personnel. Nurses, orderlies, some kind of auxiliary corps. Most are malnourished, dehydrated, the usual. Thornton did a quick visual assessment last night, cleared them for general population holding. Thornton did a visual assessment? Maggie set down her cup. He actually examined them? Crawford's mouth twitched, the closest she ever came to a smile. He looked at them through the fence and said they weren't bleeding to death. You know how he is about female patients, especially enemy ones. Captain James Thornton had made his opinions abundantly clear during the 3 months Maggie had been assigned to the camp. Women were distractions. Enemy women were security risks. Enemy women who might need medical attention were someone else's problem. He was a brilliant surgeon. Maggie had watched him reconstruct a Marine's face after a grenade blast with the kind of precision that belonged in a teaching hospital. But his bedside manner made barbed wire seem welcoming. So you want me to do an actual examination? Full medical workup. Document everything. The Red Cross is breathing down MacArthur's neck about treatment of prisoners. And I need paperwork showing we're following Geneva Convention protocols. Crawford finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds. I know what you're thinking. Yes, it's bullshit. Yes, we're short-staffed. Yes, there are American boys who need attention more. But unless you want some journalist writing about how we let Japanese prisoners die of neglect, you'll smile and do the job. Maggie had learned not to argue with Crawford. The major had served in France during the Great War, back when they still called it that, back when people genuinely believed it would be the last one. She'd seen mustard gas and trench foot and the Spanish flu that killed more people than all the artillery in Europe. If Crawford said jump, you asked how high and then added another foot for good measure. I'll need an interpreter. Already arranged. Gonzalez will meet you at the detention compound at 0700. Maria Gonzalez was waiting when Maggie arrived, looking uncomfortable in her uniform. She was young, 22 according to her file, with dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who should still be in college. Her parents had been born in Kyoto, immigrated to Los Angeles in 1920, built a small grocery store, raised 3 children who spoke English better than Japanese. Then came December 7, 1941, and suddenly being American wasn't enough anymore. Maria spent 2 years in Manzanar before the Army decided her language skills were more valuable than her heritage was dangerous. Morning, Lieutenant. Maria's salute was crisp, almost defiant. She'd learned to overcompensate, to be more military than the soldiers, more American than the Americans. At ease, Private. Have you been briefed? 40 Japanese female prisoners. Medical examination. Full documentation. Standard procedure. Maria shifted her weight. Can I ask something? Go ahead. Why didn't they use one of the male interpreters, Kawamoto or Sato? Maggie had wondered the same thing. Crawford didn't say. Maybe she thought female patients would be more comfortable with female staff. Or maybe she knows the men would be less sympathetic. Maria's voice went flat. My cousin died at Manzanar. Tuberculosis. She was 16. The camp doctor said she had a cold, told her to rest. By the time they moved her to the hospital barracks, it was too late. The words hung between them like smoke. Maggie thought about asking more, offering some kind of comfort. But comfort was a luxury nobody could afford. Instead, she picked up her medical bag and headed toward the compound. The detention area was surrounded by 2 fences, each topped with barbed wire, separated by a 10-foot no-man's land that sentries patrolled every 15 minutes. The women were housed in a single large tent at the eastern edge, guarded by 2 Marines who looked young enough to be in high school. They snapped to attention when Maggie approached. "Lieutenant Sullivan, here for medical examination of the prisoners." The younger Marine, his name tape read Kowalski, glanced at Maria with barely concealed suspicion. "The Japs speak English? Private Gonzalez is your superior officer, Marine?" Maggie's voice could have frozen water. "You'll address her appropriately or I'll have a conversation with your CO about military courtesy." Kowalski's face went red. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." Inside the tent, 40 women sat in silence. They'd arranged themselves in precise rows despite the absence of any furniture, back straight, hands folded in laps, eyes fixed on nothing. Most wore the remnants of military-style uniforms, gray or khaki, many torn and stained. Some were barefoot. Their ages ranged from late teens to mid-30s, but they all wore the same expression of carefully controlled terror. Maggie had seen that look before. It was the look of people who expected to die and were trying to maintain dignity while they waited. "Tell them I'm a nurse," Maggie said quietly to Maria. "Tell them I'm here to check their health, not to hurt them." Maria spoke in rapid Japanese. None of the women moved. None of them looked up. "Try again. Tell them this is required by military regulation, but I'll be as quick and gentle as possible." Maria repeated the message. Still nothing. Then, from the back row, 1 woman stood. She was older than most of the others, mid-20s Maggie estimated, with short hair and a bearing that suggested rank. She spoke in clear, unaccented English. "I am Sergeant Keiko Matsumoto, Japanese Army Nursing Corps. These women are under my supervision. We will cooperate with your examination." Maggie blinked. "You speak English? I studied at missionary school before the war. I can translate if it helps your work proceed more efficiently." Keiko's face was carefully neutral, but her hands trembled slightly. "May I ask what will happen to us after the examination?" "You'll be transferred to a larger facility. Beyond that, I don't know." Maggie set down her medical bag. "Have any of you been examined by a doctor since your capture?" "A man looked at us through the fence last night. He did not enter." "Thornton?" "Of course." Maggie felt a familiar anger building but pushed it down. Anger was another luxury nobody could afford. "All right. I need to do individual examinations. Standard procedure, temperature, blood pressure, check for injuries or illness. I'll need each of you to step behind that partition." She gestured to a canvas screen the Marines had set up in the corner. "Sergeant Matsumoto, you're first." Keiko followed without hesitation, but Maggie noticed the way her breathing had quickened. Behind the screen, she stood at rigid attention while Maggie pulled out a thermometer, blood pressure cuff, stethoscope. "You can sit." Maggie pointed to the folding chair. "This will be easier if you're not about to pass out." Keiko sat. Up close, Maggie could see the signs of prolonged stress, dark circles under her eyes, cracked lips, skin that had the papery quality of severe dehydration. Her uniform hung loosely, suggesting recent weight loss. "Open your mouth." Maggie inserted the thermometer. While they waited, she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Keiko's arm. The reading was low, 90/60, consistent with dehydration and malnutrition. The thermometer read 99.8, slightly elevated but nothing alarming. "Any pain? Injuries?" "No." "Any illness? Cough, fever, digestive problems?" "No." Maggie pressed the stethoscope to Keiko's back. Deep breath. The lungs sounded clear. Heart rate was elevated but regular. Another breath. Still clear. "You can..." Keiko coughed. It was quick, almost suppressed, the kind of cough you try to hide during a quiet moment. She covered her mouth with her hand. "How long have you had that cough?" "It's nothing. Dust from the roads." Maggie had heard that before. Men with shrapnel in their legs claiming they'd twisted an ankle. Soldiers with sucking chest wounds insisting they'd just had the wind knocked out of them. The military taught you to minimize, to push through, to never admit weakness. Cough again. Deliberately this time. Keiko did. It was wet, productive, coming from deep in the chest. Maggie moved the stethoscope to different positions, listening carefully. There, a slight crackling in the upper right lobe. Rails. Her stomach tightened. Night sweats? Sometimes. Weight loss? Everyone loses weight in war. How much, roughly? 20 pounds. Maybe more. Maggie sat back. 20 pounds on a frame that probably started at 110. She looked at Keiko's neck, noticing for the first time the slightly swollen lymph nodes. Classic presentation. Textbook, really. I need to examine the others now, but Sergeant Matsumoto, I want you to know that lying to medical personnel about symptoms doesn't help anyone. If you're sick, I need to know. Keiko met her eyes. If I'm sick, will you treat me, or will you let me die because it's more convenient? The question hung in the air between them, sharp and honest. Maggie thought about all the easy answers. Protocol requires treatment. Geneva Convention mandates care. We're not barbarians. But they all felt hollow. I became a nurse to help people, she said finally. Not to choose who deserves to live. Something shifted in Keiko's expression, though Maggie couldn't quite identify what. Then you are a better person than this war deserves. The second examination was a young woman named Sachiko Ito, 34 years old, a teacher before the war who'd been pressed into medical service. She was polite, cooperative, and when Maggie asked her to breathe deeply, she heard the same crackling rails. Fever, 100.1, slightly swollen lymph nodes, persistent cough she tried to suppress. The third was Haruka Yamada, 23, a radio operator. Hostile, suspicious, refusing to make eye contact. Same symptoms. Fever, 99.9. Same cough, same rails. By the fifth examination, Maggie's hands had started to shake. By the 10th, she was taking notes with mechanical precision, each entry identical to the last. Patient presence with low-grade fever, persistent cough, night sweats, recent weight loss, lymphadenopathy, rails in upper lobes. Patient, patient, patient. 40 variations of the same deadly pattern. When she examined number 12, Emiko Watanabe, 19 years old, barely more than a child, the girl coughed and blood speckled her hand. Not much, just a few drops. Enough. Maggie stood up so fast the chair fell backward. Maria jumped. Lieutenant, I need to speak with Major Crawford, now. Maggie's voice came out strangled. She picked up her bag with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Stay here. Don't let anyone leave this tent. Don't let anyone else enter. What's wrong? Maggie looked at the 40 women sitting in their careful rows, waiting patiently to learn their fate. Most of them were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Everything, she managed. Everything is wrong. She made it outside the tent before her knees gave out. She sat in the mud in the space between the fences, and for the first time in 3 years, she cried. Not gentle tears. Harsh, ugly sobbing that came from somewhere deep in her chest. Somewhere she'd locked away the day she decided feeling was too dangerous. The Marines stared at her. She didn't care. Maria found her there 5 minutes later. She sat down in the mud beside her, not speaking, just present. They're all dying, Maggie finally said. All 40 of them. Tuberculosis. Advanced cases, most of them. And they're sitting in that tent together, sharing air, breathing it in and out, making each other sicker. You don't know for sure. You'd need x-rays, sputum tests. I know. Maggie wiped her face with her sleeve. I've seen enough TB in field hospitals to recognize it. The night sweats, the fever, the weight loss, the bloody cough. Emiko's already hemoptysis. If we don't treat them immediately, they'll all be dead in a month, and they'll take out half this camp with them. Maria went very still. The camp? You mean the other prisoners? I mean everyone. Marines, soldiers, prisoners, staff. Tuberculosis doesn't care what uniform you wear. It doesn't care who won the war. You put 40 active cases in a crowded camp with poor sanitation and limited medical facilities and you get an epidemic. What are you going to do? Maggie stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but she locked her knees and forced herself upright. I'm going to save their lives. And then I'm probably going to get court-martialed for it. Major Crawford listened to Maggie's report with the kind of attention most people reserve for defusing bombs. When Maggie finished, Crawford leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. You're absolutely certain. As certain as I can be without laboratory confirmation. But Betty, I've treated TB cases. I know what it looks like. And 40 cases presenting with nearly identical symptoms in a single cohort? That's not coincidence. That's an outbreak. 40 enemy combatants. 40 disease vectors. Maggie kept her voice level. If we quarantine them without treatment, they'll die. If we release them into general population, they'll infect hundreds more. If we transfer them to Guam, we'll spread it across the entire detention system. Crawford picked up a pencil, put it down, picked it up again. It was the closest to agitated Maggie had ever seen her. What do you need? Immediate isolation. Proper quarantine facility, not a tent. Chest x-rays to confirm diagnosis. Sputum cultures. And streptomycin. Lots of streptomycin. You're aware streptomycin is still experimental. Limited supply. Reserved for critical American personnel. I'm aware. I'm also aware that if we don't use it now, we're going to need 10 times as much to treat the epidemic. You're also aware that requisitioning experimental antibiotics for enemy prisoners is going to require authorization from someone much higher up the chain than me. Then get it. Maggie met Crawford's eyes. Betty, this is bigger than politics. This is basic epidemiology. We either contain this now or we lose control entirely. Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Colonel Harrington will never approve this. You know that, right? He lost his son at Iwo Jima. He's not going to sign off on giving Japanese prisoners medication we're rationing for our own troops. Then go over his head. To who? MacArthur. You think the Supreme Commander of the Pacific Theater is going to prioritize 40 enemy nurses over American combat personnel? I think, Maggie said carefully, that MacArthur's career depends on maintaining operational effectiveness. And a tuberculosis epidemic that spreads through prisoner camps, military bases, and eventually back to occupying forces is the opposite of operational effectiveness. Crawford smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about nothing else since I left that tent. All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to write up a formal report with every detail, every symptom, every piece of evidence. You're going to make it so technical and terrifying that anyone who reads it understands we're sitting on a biological time bomb. Then you're going to present it to Harrington. He'll never listen to me. Probably not. But protocol requires it. And when he refuses, we'll have documentation showing we followed proper channels. Then I'll take it higher. Crawford stood up. In the meantime, get those women isolated. Use the old surgical tent on the north end. It's been empty since we moved operations. Post guards. No one in or out without proper protective equipment. And Sullivan? Yes, ma'am? Prepare yourself for a fight, because this is going to get ugly. Colonel Robert Thaddeus Harrington kept his office at exactly 68 degrees, regardless of the Okinawan heat outside. He sat behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a bank, every paper aligned at perfect right angles, every pen lined up with military precision. On the wall behind him hung a photograph of a young Marine in dress uniform, smiling with the kind of optimism that only existed before you learned what war actually meant. Maggie stood at attention while Harrington read her report. He took his time, turning each page with deliberate care, his face revealing nothing. When he finished, he set the papers down and aligned them perfectly with the edge of his desk. Tuberculosis. Yes, sir. 40 cases. Yes, sir. Japanese prisoners. Yes, sir. Harrington folded his hands. They were large hands, scarred from years of manual work before he became an officer. And your recommended course of action is to requisition experimental antibiotics, establish specialized quarantine facilities, and divert medical resources to treat enemy combatants who were trying to kill Americans 6 weeks ago. Sir, with respect, tuberculosis was trying to kill Americans 6 weeks ago. It's still trying now. If we don't contain this, I've read your report, Lieutenant. The epidemiological projections, the infection rates, all very impressive. Tell me something. He leaned forward. How many American soldiers are currently waiting for medical supplies in this theater? I don't have exact numbers, sir. I do. 43,000 wounded personnel requiring ongoing treatment. Another 18,000 cases of malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases. We're rationing morphine. We're rationing penicillin. Last week, I had to decide whether to authorize pain medication for a Marine who lost both legs or save it for surgical cases. He was 19 years old, and I had to tell him to grit his teeth because we didn't have enough drugs to waste on making him comfortable. Harrington's voice never rose above conversational. That somehow made it worse. Now you want me to take our limited supply of an experimental antibiotic and give it to Japanese prisoners. You want me to explain to American mothers why their sons died without medication while enemy soldiers received treatment. Do you understand what you're asking? Maggie forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm asking you to prevent an epidemic that will kill more Americans than the Battle of Okinawa. That's speculation. That's mathematics. Tuberculosis in crowded conditions spreads exponentially. We have approximately 4,000 personnel on this base. Conservative infection rate puts us at 200 cases within 6 weeks. Mortality rate without treatment is 60%. That's 120 dead Americans because we failed to quarantine and treat the initial outbreak. Or we isolate the Japanese prisoners and let nature take its course. 40 dead enemies. 0 dead Americans. The words landed like a physical blow. Maggie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sir, that would be a violation of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention requires us to provide reasonable medical care. It doesn't require us to give prisoners experimental medications we don't have enough of for our own troops. Harrington picked up a pen, made a notation on a different document. Your request is denied. Isolate the prisoners, provide supportive care, fluids, rest, basic pain management. Document everything for Red Cross inspection, but no streptomycin, no specialized treatment. Is that clear? Sir, they'll die. Yes. Harrington looked up. They will. And that's unfortunate. But I'm not in the business of prioritizing enemy lives over American ones. Dismissed. Maggie didn't move. 3 years of military discipline warred with 3 years of medical training. Colonel, if I may... You may not. Dismissed, Lieutenant. She saluted. It took everything she had. Outside Harrington's office, she found Captain Thornton waiting, arms crossed, expression smug. Let me guess. He said no. You knew he would. Of course I knew. Anyone with half a brain knew. Thornton fell into step beside her. Look, Sullivan, I get it. You're a nurse. You want to save everyone. Very noble. But this is war. People die. Enemy people die first. That's how it works. Those women are sick. Those women are combatants. They wore uniforms. They supported enemy military operations. They contributed to killing Americans. The fact that they're dying of disease instead of bullets doesn't make them any less responsible for what happened. Maggie stopped walking. Is that what you tell yourself? That it's okay to withhold treatment because they're the enemy? I tell myself that I have a job to do, and that job is keeping American soldiers alive. Every gram of streptomycin I give to a Japanese prisoner is a gram I can't give to a Marine. Every hour I spend treating enemies is an hour I'm not treating allies. Thornton's voice dropped. 6 months ago, I operated on a kid from Nebraska, 20 years old. Grenade took off half his face. I rebuilt his jaw using bone from his hip, reconstructed his cheek with tissue grafts, spent 14 hours in surgery. He lived. 3 weeks later, I ran out of penicillin for his infection because command diverted our supplies to another base. He died of sepsis, drowning in his own pus because I didn't have $20 worth of antibiotics. He leaned closer. So forgive me if I'm not eager to give experimental medications to people who were shooting at that kid 6 months ago. You want to play St. Clara of Assisi, go ahead. But don't expect me to help you. He walked away. Maggie stood in the hallway, shaking with rage she couldn't express, couldn't channel, couldn't use. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. Resources were limited. Choices had to be made. In pure utilitarian calculus, saving American soldiers over Japanese prisoners made perfect sense. But calculus didn't account for the way Emiko Watanabe had tried to smile when Maggie examined her, even though she was coughing blood. It didn't account for the careful dignity of 40 women sitting in precise rows, waiting to die with as much grace as they could manage. It didn't account for the fact that disease didn't care about nationality, and epidemic didn't respect battle lines. She found Maria in the mess tent, eating something that claimed to be stew but looked like regret suspended in grease. I need your help. Maria set down her spoon. Legal help or illegal help? I need you to teach me Japanese medical terminology. Everything related to tuberculosis, symptoms, treatment, explanations. I need to be able to communicate with those women without an interpreter present. Why? Because I'm going to treat them anyway, and I can't risk you getting court-martialed as an accessory. Maria was quiet for a long moment. You know they'll destroy your career for this. Probably. You could be dishonorably discharged, lose your nursing license, end up in military prison. I know. Then why? Maggie thought about the question. It should have been complicated, but it wasn't. Because I looked at 40 women this morning and saw 40 people who are going to die preventable deaths if I do nothing. And I can't do nothing. I tried that for 3 years. It broke something in me. If I let these women die because it's politically convenient, I'll never get that piece back. Maria pushed her stew away. Okay. When do we start? The lessons happened at night, after official duties ended, in the corner of the nurses' barracks where they were least likely to be overheard. Maria wrote out phonetic pronunciations, made Maggie repeat phrases until they sounded natural, explained the careful politeness that Japanese required even in medical contexts. When you ask about symptoms, use nanika for something and arimasuka for is there. So do you have fever becomes netsuga arimasuka. Netsuga arimasuka, Maggie repeated. And if they say yes? Hi means yes. Means no. But they might also just nod or shake their head. Body language works the same everywhere. What about explaining treatment? That's harder. Medical terminology is complex. Your best bet is to demonstrate and use simple words. Kusuri, medicine. Chusha, injection. Nonde kudasai, please drink. They practiced for 3 hours. Maggie's pronunciation was terrible. Maria winced frequently, but she could make herself understood. That would have to be enough. Meanwhile, she moved the 40 women to the old surgical tent. It was better than the detention compound. More space, better ventilation, actual cots instead of bare ground. But it was still a death sentence without medication. She set up what quarantine protocols she could with available supplies. Surgical masks for anyone entering, separate eating utensils, isolation from general camp population. The women accepted the transfer with the same silent dignity they'd shown before. Keiko helped organize them, establishing sleeping arrangements, coordinating bathroom schedules, maintaining order. She moved like someone who'd been in charge before, who understood that leadership meant taking responsibility for the survival of everyone under your command. On the third night, Maggie found her sitting outside the tent, staring at the stars. She'd lost weight even in the few days since the examination. Her uniform hung looser, her face more gaunt. You should be resting. I rest enough. Keiko's voice was hoarse. The cough was getting worse. Tell me something, Lieutenant. When you examined us, you knew immediately what was wrong. Yes? No point in lying. Yes. And you reported it to your superiors? Yes. And they refused treatment. They refused specialized treatment. I'm authorized to provide supportive care. Supportive care? Keiko smiled without humor. A kind way to say, let them die comfortably. My English is better than you think. I know what those words mean. Maggie sat down beside her. It probably violated a dozen protocols, but she was already planning to commit career suicide. Sitting with a prisoner seemed minor by comparison. What happened to you? Before you were captured, I mean. Where were you serving? Philippines. Manila mostly. Army hospital near the port. Keiko coughed, covered her mouth, continued. We treated wounded soldiers. Japanese mostly, but sometimes civilians. Sometimes American prisoners. You treated American prisoners? Of course, they were wounded. That's what doctors and nurses do. We treat the wounded. Keiko looked at her. Or that's what I thought. Your Captain Thornton explained that I was wrong. That medicine has sides. Thornton is an asshole. It was worth it just to see Keiko's shocked expression. Despite everything, despite the war and the disease and the death, she laughed. It turned into a coughing fit, wet and painful, but when she recovered, she was smiling. I saved an American soldier in Manila, she said quietly. February 1945. He had sepsis from a leg wound. The Japanese doctor said to let him die. Waste of resources. But I knew how to treat sepsis. I'd seen it before. So I stole antibiotics from our supply room, treated him at night when no one was watching. He lived. 2 weeks later, he was transferred to a different camp. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crumpled piece of metal. A dog tag. He gave me this. Said maybe someday it would help someone believe I wasn't a monster. I don't know if he survived the rest of the war. I don't know if anyone told his family what happened. But I know I did the right thing, even though it could have gotten me executed. Maggie took the dog tag. It read, PFC Thomas Chen, U.S. Army, O+ blood type. The metal was warm from being held. Why are you telling me this? Because you're trying to decide if we're worth saving. If 40 Japanese nurses deserve the same care you'd give 40 American nurses. And I want you to know that some of us made the same choice you're making now. Some of us chose medicine over war, even when it was dangerous, even when it was stupid. Keiko took back the dog tag. That American soldier, Thomas Chen, he was someone's son, maybe someone's brother. He would have died if I'd followed orders. Instead, I broke them. If I'm going to die now, I'd like to think it meant something. That somewhere, that soldier is alive, and maybe he tells people about the enemy nurse who saved his life. Maggie stood up. Get some rest, Sergeant. Doctor's orders. Lieutenant Sullivan? Keiko's voice stopped her. Whatever you're planning, be careful. They will punish you for helping us. I know. And you're going to do it anyway. I know that too. Getting the streptomycin required careful planning. The camp pharmacy kept controlled medications in a locked cabinet in the medical supply tent, monitored by a log sheet that required signatures for every withdrawal. Simply stealing it would be noticed immediately. Maggie needed a legitimate reason to access the medication, and she needed enough of it to treat 40 patients for the full course. 6 to 8 weeks of daily injections. The math was depressing. Each patient needed roughly 2 grams per day. 40 patients meant 80 grams daily, 560 grams per week, approximately 4,500 grams for a full treatment course. The camp had maybe 500 grams total, rationed carefully for American personnel with severe infections. She needed another source. Lieutenant Michael O'Brien ran supply logistics for the Medical Corps on Okinawa. He was 31, perpetually exhausted, and had perfected the art of creative accounting that kept military operations functional. Every base had someone like him, the person who could acquire things that weren't officially available, who understood that paperwork was more important than reality, who knew which rules were sacred and which were suggestions. Maggie found him in the supply warehouse conducting inventory with the enthusiasm of someone contemplating dental surgery. O'Brien, I need a favor. He didn't look up from his clipboard. Everyone needs favors. Get in line. I need streptomycin. A lot of it. At least 5 kilograms. That got his attention. 5 kilos? Jesus Christ, Sullivan, what are you planning to do? Treat the entire Imperial Japanese Army? Just 40 prisoners. Oh, well, that's reasonable then. His sarcasm could have stripped paint. You know streptomycin is Class A controlled, right? I'd have an easier time getting you heroin. At least with heroin, I'd only get 10 years in Leavenworth instead of 20. I know what I'm asking. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're asking me to commit career suicide, theft of military property, and possibly treason. Also, you can treat prisoners that command has explicitly refused to authorize treatment for. Maggie had prepared for this. She pulled out a folder, set it on the stack of supply crates between them. Read this. What is it? Epidemiological projection. If we don't treat the current outbreak, we're looking at approximately 200 cases within 6 weeks. That means 6 weeks of quarantine protocols, medical resources, and productivity loss. Conservative estimate puts the cost at $3 million. Treatment now costs about $5,000 worth of antibiotics. O'Brien flipped through the report. You wrote this? With help from Major Crawford. She won't say it officially, but she agrees with the analysis. And Harrington? Harrington wants to isolate and let them die. Which is the legally safe option? Which is the option that leads to an epidemic? O'Brien set down the folder. Let me make sure I understand. You want me to steal 5 kilos of streptomycin from military medical supplies, falsify documentation to cover the theft, and provide it to you so you can treat prisoners in direct violation of orders from a full colonel. And your justification is that it might prevent a hypothetical epidemic that might happen if we don't treat them. That's about right, yes. You're insane. Probably. You'll get court-martialed. Probably. I'll get court-martialed. Only if they catch us. O'Brien laughed. It was not a happy sound. Sullivan, they always catch you. That's the thing about the military. There's a paper trail for everything. The second I divert 5 kilos of streptomycin, someone's going to notice. And when they investigate, they're going to find out where it went, and then we're both fucked. So make it look legitimate. Say it's for treatment of American personnel with respiratory infections. File the paperwork properly. By the time anyone audits the records, the treatment will be complete. And when they ask where the American patients are, tell them they recovered and were discharged to regular duty, or transferred to different bases. Medical records get lost all the time in war zones. O'Brien pinched the bridge of his nose. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I once watched a private try to smoke a cigarette while refueling a jeep. Is that a yes? It's an acknowledgement that you've found my weakness, which is an inability to ignore mathematical logic. He picked up the folder again. These projections, they're solid. You're not exaggerating to justify what you want to do. They're conservative estimates. If anything, I'm underestimating the spread rate. And if we do this, if I get you the streptomycin and you treat them, what's the success rate? With proper treatment, 80 to 90% survival. Without it, 40% die within 3 months. O'Brien was quiet for a long time. My brother had tuberculosis, he said finally. In 1938, he was 15. We couldn't afford treatment. My parents tried everything. Sent him to a sanatorium in the mountains, special diet, cod liver oil. All the folk remedies. He died anyway. Took 6 months. By the end, he weighed maybe 70 pounds, and he was coughing up pieces of his lungs. He met Maggie's eyes. I was 12. I had to watch him die slowly, knowing there was medicine that could have saved him if we'd had money for it. And now you're telling me that we have the medicine, but we're not using it because of politics. I'm sorry about your brother. Don't be sorry, just don't waste the medication. If I'm going to throw away my career for this, I want those 40 women to live. All of them. Deal? Deal. Give me 3 days. I'll have the streptomycin by Friday. You'll need syringes, alcohol wipes, proper storage. I'll include those too, but Sullivan, you're going to owe me the biggest favor in the history of the Pacific Theater. Name it. I haven't decided yet, but when I do, you'll do it. No questions, no hesitation. Whatever I ask. Agreed. Maggie thought about what she was promising. A blank check to a supply officer who had just agreed to commit theft. But 40 women were dying, and she was out of options. Agreed. The streptomycin arrived Friday morning, hidden in a crate labeled surgical supplies, perishable. O'Brien had included everything: syringes, needles, alcohol prep pads, even a detailed instruction sheet on proper dosing and administration. There was enough for 8 weeks of treatment with some buffer for complications. Maggie waited until late evening, after official duties ended and most personnel were in the mess tent or barracks. She loaded the supplies into her medical bag, added some legitimate items to make it look routine, and headed toward the quarantine tent. The guard on duty was Private Rodriguez, young and nervous, the kind of soldier who followed orders precisely because thinking for himself was terrifying. Evening, Lieutenant. Evening, Rodriguez, just checking on the patients. Captain Thornton's orders say no medical treatment beyond supportive care, ma'am. I'm aware of the captain's orders. I'm here to monitor vital signs and ensure the patients are stable. Standard quarantine protocol. Rodriguez clearly wanted to argue but didn't have the authority. He let her pass. Inside the tent, conditions had deteriorated. Several women were feverish. Most were coughing, and Emiko Watanabe looked like she might not make it through the night. Keiko was moving between patients, providing water, offering what comfort she could with no medications. She froze when she saw Maggie's bag. Sergeant Matsumoto, I need your help. What kind of help? Maggie set down the bag, pulled out a vial of streptomycin, the kind that might get both of us executed. Can you administer injections? Keiko stared at the vial. You got it, the medication, but your colonel refused. I didn't ask the colonel, I'm asking you. Can you help me, or do I need to treat all 40 patients myself? For the first time since they'd met, Keiko smiled a genuine smile. I can help. What do you need? They worked through the night. Maggie showed Keiko the proper dosing. 1 gram twice daily for adults, adjusted for weight. They started with the most critical cases, Emiko first, then 3 others who were showing signs of advanced disease. The injections had to be intramuscular, deep in the gluteal muscle, rotated between sides to prevent abscess formation. The women endured it stoically. Most didn't ask questions. A few thanked Maggie in soft Japanese. One, Haruka Yamada, the hostile radio operator, cried silently while receiving her injection, tears running down her face without sound. Why does she cry? Maggie asked Keiko. She thought she would die. We all thought we would die. You're giving her hope. Sometimes hope is more painful than despair. By dawn, all 40 women had received their first dose. Maggie showed Keiko how to store the medication properly, how to maintain the injection schedule, how to monitor for adverse reactions. This needs to continue every day for 6 to 8 weeks. I'll come when I can, but there will be times when I can't get away without raising suspicion. You'll need to handle some injections yourself. I understand. Keiko hesitated. Lieutenant Sullivan, why are you doing this? You're risking everything. Your career, your freedom, maybe your life. We're enemies. We're supposed to be beneath your concern. Maggie packed up her bag. She was exhausted, wired on adrenaline and fear, and the question deserved a better answer than she had. My father was a doctor, small town in Iowa, population maybe 3,000. He treated everyone, farmers, shopkeepers, even the homeless men who rode the rails during the Depression. When I was 16, someone asked him why he'd spend hours treating a vagrant who couldn't pay when he had paying patients waiting. You know what he said? Keiko shook her head. He said, because that man is sick, and I'm a doctor, and that's the whole job. No politics, no economics, no judgment, just medicine. Maggie shouldered her bag. I spent 3 years forgetting that, letting the war turn patients into problems, people into statistics. But when I examined you and the others, I remembered. That's the whole job, and I've been doing it wrong. She left before Keiko could respond. Outside, the sun was rising over Okinawa, turning the sky shades of pink and gold that had no right to be that beautiful in a place that had seen so much death. Rodriguez was still at his post, looking exhausted. Everything okay in there, Lieutenant? Everything's fine, Private, just monitoring vital signs. She made it back to the nurse's barracks, collapsed onto her cot, and slept for 3 hours before Crawford shook her awake. Sullivan, we have a problem. Maggie sat up, instantly alert. What kind of problem? The kind where Captain Thornton has questions about why you're spending so much time in the quarantine tent. The kind where Colonel Harrington is demanding a full report on the status of the Japanese prisoners. The kind where if you've done what I think you've done, we're both going to end our careers in spectacular fashion. Betty, I don't want to know. Officially, I don't want to know. Unofficially, tell me you were careful. I was careful. Careful enough that it won't be obvious. Careful enough that we have plausible deniability for at least a week. After that, when the patients start showing improvement, it's going to be impossible to hide. Crawford sat down on the adjacent cot. She suddenly looked old, worn down by years of war and bureaucracy and impossible choices. You know what's going to happen when they figure it out. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison time. And you're okay with that? Maggie thought about 40 women who would be alive when they should have been dead. About an epidemic prevented before it started. About choosing to be human in a situation designed to make humanity impossible. I'm okay with it. Crawford nodded slowly. Then we better make sure you don't get caught. At least not until those women are well enough to be transferred. Once they're out of this camp, it becomes someone else's problem. Until then, we need to control the narrative. How? By giving Harrington what he wants. A report showing that the Japanese prisoners are being properly isolated, provided with supportive care per Geneva Convention requirements, and pose minimal risk to camp personnel. Nothing about active treatment, nothing about antibiotics, just a nice boring document that says everything is under control. You'd lie for me. I prefer to think of it as strategic omission. I'm not saying you're treating them. I'm just not saying you're not treating them. There's a difference. Crawford stood up. Write the report today. Make it thorough, technical, and deadly boring. I'll submit it to Harrington with my endorsement. That should buy you a few weeks before anyone looks too closely. And when they do look closely, then we'll deal with it. But Sullivan, when this falls apart, and it will fall apart, I'm going to deny knowing anything about it. I'll testify that you acted alone against orders without authorization. I'll throw you under every bus, truck, and tank in the Pacific Theater. I understand. Good. Because while I'm doing that publicly, I'll be working privately to make sure you don't spend the next 20 years in Leavenworth. I've been in this army for 27 years. I've got connections. I'll use them. But I need you to be the visible sacrifice so I can work behind the scenes. Can you accept that? Maggie thought about it. Being publicly disgraced so Crawford could pull strings privately. Taking the full blame so others could help without being implicated. It was pragmatic, ruthless, and probably the only way any of them survived this. I can accept it. Then get to work on that report. And Sullivan, Thank you for having the courage to do what I should have done myself. Crawford left. Maggie stared at the canvas ceiling of the barracks and wondered when exactly her life had become a game of chess, where she was simultaneously playing and being played. The next 2 weeks established a routine. Maggie visited the quarantine tent daily, ostensibly to monitor vital signs and ensure proper isolation protocols. In reality, she was administering streptomycin, tracking patient responses, adjusting dosages for side effects. Keiko helped, learning quickly, asking intelligent questions, becoming more collaborator than patient. The women were responding to treatment. Fevers dropped, coughs lessened, weight started to stabilize. Emiko Watanabe, who'd been hours from death, sat up on her cot and asked for food. It was working. The medication was actually working. But success brought new problems. As patients improved, it became harder to explain why supposedly terminal TB cases were surviving. Thornton noticed. He cornered Maggie outside the mess tent on day 12. I reviewed the vital signs reports from the quarantine tent. Okay. Several patients showing improvement. Fever resolution, decreased respiratory symptoms, improved appetite. That's good news. Is it? Because untreated tuberculosis doesn't spontaneously improve, Sullivan. It gets worse. Progressively, inevitably worse, until the patients die or receive specific antibiotic therapy. Thornton stepped closer. So either you've discovered a miracle cure, or someone is treating those prisoners against direct orders. Maybe their TB wasn't as advanced as I thought. You wrote in your initial assessment that multiple patients showed signs of advanced disease. Now you're saying you were wrong? Diagnoses can be premature, without x-rays or lab confirmation. Bullshit. The word came out flat, factual. You know what you saw. You're treating them. With what I don't know, probably streptomycin from God knows where. But you're treating them. Maggie met his eyes. If I were treating them, which I'm not confirming or denying, wouldn't that be the ethically correct choice? Prevent an epidemic, save lives, uphold medical standards. Ethically correct, legally wrong. You want to know the difference between us, Sullivan? I follow orders even when they're hard. You break them when they're inconvenient. That makes you feel noble, but it makes you dangerous. And letting 40 women die of preventable disease makes you feel what exactly? Patriotic? It makes me feel like I'm doing my job, which is supporting American military objectives, not playing Mother Teresa to enemy combatants. Thornton leaned in. I'm going to figure out what you're doing, and when I do, I'm going to report it. Not because I hate you, but because rules matter, especially in war. Especially when breaking them means taking resources from Americans and giving them to enemies. He walked away. Maggie's hands were shaking. She'd known this moment would come, but knowing and experiencing were different things. Thornton was smart, observant, and motivated by genuine belief that he was doing the right thing. He'd find proof. It was only a matter of time. She found O'Brien in the supply warehouse, told him what happened. How long before he figures out where you got the streptomycin? Depends on how carefully he looks. I falsified the requisition forms, but they won't hold up to serious scrutiny. If he checks with other bases, compares supply records, talks to the right people, maybe a week, 2 at most. The treatment needs 6 to 8 weeks. I know, we're not going to make it. Maggie felt something sharp and cold settle in her chest. What are our options? Run, desert, take the women and disappear into the Okinawan countryside. That's insane. Yeah, but it's the only option that doesn't end with both of us in prison. Or, O'Brien hesitated, or we confess. Now before Thornton finds proof. Take responsibility, accept punishment, hope for leniency because we turned ourselves in. And the women would have to hope someone else continues treatment. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. Maggie thought about Emiko, finally strong enough to walk around the tent. About Keiko, teaching the younger women basic English phrases. About 40 people who were alive because someone had broken rules meant to let them die with dignity. I'm not confessing until they're well. If that means running, we run. O'Brien laughed. Jesus Christ, you're serious. Completely. You know we'd last maybe 48 hours, right? Okinawa isn't that big. We don't speak Japanese. We'd be captured immediately. Probably. But those 48 hours might give Crawford enough time to push the case up the chain of command, get official authorization, make the treatment retroactively legitimate. That's not a plan. That's a prayer. You have a better idea? He didn't. They both knew it. They were out of good options, down to choosing between flavors of disaster. The decision was taken out of their hands 3 days later. Colonel Harrington called an emergency meeting of senior medical staff. Maggie, Crawford, Thornton, and 2 other doctors crowded into his frigid office while he stood at his window, back turned, shoulders rigid. Yesterday, I received a communication from Pacific Fleet Medical Command. They're conducting an audit of streptomycin usage across all bases in theater. Apparently, there have been reports of missing supplies, falsified requisitions, and unauthorized treatments. He turned around. Anyone here have any idea what that might be about? Silence. Thornton looked at Maggie with something that might have been sympathy. Might have been. Lieutenant Sullivan, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and you're going to give me a direct answer. Have you been treating the Japanese prisoners in quarantine with streptomycin or any other controlled medication? This was it. The moment where lying would make everything worse, but telling the truth would end everything immediately. Maggie thought about her father, treating vagrants who couldn't pay. About Keiko, saving an American soldier in Manila. About 40 women whose only crime was being sick on the wrong side of a war they didn't start. Yes, sir, I have. The words landed like artillery shells. Crawford closed her eyes. One of the other doctors swore softly. Thornton's expression didn't change. Against my direct orders. Yes, sir. Using medication obtained through falsified requisitions. Yes, sir. With full knowledge that you were violating military law, medical supply regulations, and operational orders. Yes, sir. Harrington was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Explain to me why I shouldn't have you arrested immediately. Because it was the correct medical decision. Because leaving 40 active TB cases untreated in a crowded camp would have caused an epidemic that would have killed more Americans than the entire Battle of Okinawa. Because sometimes following orders means enabling preventable deaths, and I'm not willing to do that. You're not willing. Harrington's voice went cold. Lieutenant, your willingness is irrelevant. You're a soldier. You follow orders. That's the entire basis of military discipline. I'm a nurse first, sir, soldier second. And nurses don't get to choose who deserves to live based on which flag they salute. How dare you? The words came out quiet, deadly. My son died on Iwo Jima. 23 years old. He took shrapnel to the chest and bled out before the medics could reach him. Maybe if we'd had more medical supplies, better equipment, more antibiotics, he would have lived. But we didn't, because everything is rationed, because everything is limited, because we're fighting a war against an enemy that started this whole goddamn mess. Harrington's composure cracked. And now you stand here and tell me that you took medication, experimental, expensive, limited medication, and gave it to Japanese prisoners, people who might have been on Iwo Jima, people who might have killed my son, and you expect me to believe that was the correct medical decision? Maggie's throat was tight. Sir, I can't imagine your loss. No, you can't. And you don't get to use my grief to justify your insubordination. He turned to Crawford. Major, did you know about this? Crawford's face was stone. I suspected. I chose not to investigate. Why? Because Lieutenant Sullivan's epidemiological projections were sound. Because I've seen what TB can do in crowded conditions. Because sometimes the correct military decision and the correct medical decision aren't the same thing. And I've been doing this long enough to recognize when that's the case. Harrington looked at each of them. You're all aware that I can have you court-martialed for this? That I probably should have you court-martialed for this? Yes, sir, they said in unison. He sat down heavily. Here's what's going to happen. Lieutenant Sullivan, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. You'll be confined to quarters pending formal charges. Major Crawford, you'll submit a complete report detailing what you knew and when you knew it. Captain Thornton will assume responsibility for all medical operations, including the quarantine facility. Sir, Thornton spoke up. What about the prisoners? What about them? Their treatment. Sullivan started it, but if it's interrupted now, they'll relapse. We'd be back to square one. Dying prisoners, epidemic risk, all the problems Sullivan was trying to prevent. Everyone stared at Thornton. Maggie couldn't believe what she was hearing. Are you suggesting I authorize continued treatment? I'm suggesting that regardless of how we feel about Sullivan's methods, her medical assessment was correct. Those women have active tuberculosis. They're infectious. Stopping treatment now would be worse than never starting it. We'd have patients who developed antibiotic resistance, increased virulence, and even higher transmission risk. Thornton pulled out a folder. I ran the numbers. If we continue treatment through completion, we spend about $3,000 worth of medication and prevent approximately 200 secondary infections. If we stop now, we'll spend 10 times that much treating the epidemic, plus productivity losses, quarantine costs, and potential mortality among American personnel. From a pure cost-benefit analysis, continuing treatment is the economically rational choice. Harrington stared at him. You want to continue treating Japanese prisoners. I want to minimize American casualties and expenditure. The prisoners are just the vector. If they happen to be infected rats, I'd advocate treating them too. It's not about compassion, it's about math. Maggie felt something shift in her chest. Thornton, arrogant, pragmatic, rule-following Thornton, was arguing for her position, not because he agreed with her morally, but because the numbers supported it. It shouldn't have mattered why. The result was the same. Harrington rubbed his face. Get out. All of you except Crawford. I need to think. Outside, Maggie turned to Thornton. Why did you do that? Because I'm a doctor, Sullivan. I don't have to like you or agree with your methods to recognize when you're medically correct. He paused. And because my brother died of tuberculosis in 1932. If someone had broken rules to get him medication, he might still be alive. So I'm returning a favor to someone who never knew they gave it. He walked away before she could respond. Crawford emerged from Harrington's office 10 minutes later. He's making a call to Fleet Command, requesting retroactive authorization for the treatment, citing epidemic prevention and operational necessity. Will they approve it? I don't know. But there's a chance if they do, you might avoid court-martial. If they don't, Crawford didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The wait was excruciating. Maggie was confined to quarters, a tent she shared with 3 other nurses, all of whom suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. She lay on her cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, wondering if her career was over, if she'd end up in prison, if 40 women would survive or relapse when treatment was interrupted. On the 3rd day, Crawford came to find her. Fleet Command approved it. Maggie sat up so fast, she nearly fell off the cot. What? Retroactive authorization for treatment of Japanese prisoners to prevent epidemic spread. They're calling it a public health measure rather than enemy care. Technically, you were still insubordinate for not getting authorization first, but the fact that you were medically correct gives them cover to avoid a full court-martial. So what happens now? You're officially reprimanded. It goes in your permanent file. You'll probably never get promoted again. But you keep your commission, you keep your license, and you get to finish what you started. Maggie felt tears welling up. She'd been prepared for prison. A reprimand seemed impossibly light. What changed? Why did they approve it? Because someone at Fleet Medical reviewed Thornton's cost-benefit analysis and realized he was right. Because preventing an epidemic is cheaper than treating one. Because the Red Cross was starting to ask uncomfortable questions about mortality rates in detention camps. And this gives them a good story to tell. Crawford smiled slightly. And because I may have mentioned to an old friend who works in MacArthur's office that we had definitive proof medical personnel were following proper disease containment protocols, which would look very good in press releases. You manipulated them. I prefer strategically informed. But yes. Crawford's expression turned serious. You got lucky, Sullivan, very lucky. Next time you decide to save the world, clear it with command first. Yes, ma'am. Now get back to work. Those women still need 6 weeks of treatment, and you're the one who started this mess. You get to finish it. The next 6 weeks passed in careful routine. Maggie administered streptomycin twice daily, monitored for side effects, tracked patient progress with meticulous documentation. The women responded beautifully. Fevers resolved, coughs diminished, weight stabilized, and then improved. By week 4, most were strong enough to walk around the tent. By week 6, they looked like different people. Keiko recovered fastest, probably because she'd hidden the full extent of her illness initially. She became Maggie's unofficial assistant, helping with translations, organizing the other women, maintaining morale. They developed a working relationship that transcended language and nationality, built on mutual respect and shared competence. On the final day of treatment, Maggie administered the last injections. 40 women, all alive, all recovering, all scheduled for transfer to the main detention facility in Guam tomorrow. You saved us, Keiko said quietly. They were outside the tent, watching the sunset over Okinawa. We should have died. We were dying, and you refused to let us. I did my job. No, you did more than your job. You risked everything, your career, your freedom, your life, for enemies, for people you had every reason to hate. I don't hate you. You should. We're at war. My country attacked yours, killed your soldiers, committed atrocities. You would be justified in letting us die. Maggie thought about that. About Pearl Harbor and Bataan and all the reasons she should have walked away, should have followed orders, should have let disease do what bombs and bullets couldn't. My father used to say that medicine is the one profession that doesn't get to hate, because the second you decide someone doesn't deserve treatment, you stop being a healer and start being something else, something worse. She looked at Keiko. I spent 3 years becoming that something worse. This was my chance to remember who I wanted to be. Keiko was quiet for a moment. What will happen to us? In Guam, after the war? I don't know. Repatriation, probably. You'll go home to Japan. If there's a Japan to go home to. Keiko's voice was soft. We hear rumors. Bombings, cities destroyed, millions dead. My family was in Hiroshima. I don't know if they're still alive. Maggie didn't know what to say to that. In 3 weeks, Hiroshima would be gone, vaporized in an instant of nuclear fire that would kill more people than tuberculosis ever could. Keiko's family was probably dead already. They just didn't know it yet. I'm sorry. Don't be. This is war. People die. That's what happens. Keiko smiled sadly. But some people live. Because of you, 40 women live. That has to mean something. The transfer happened at dawn. 40 women, healthy enough to walk, loaded onto trucks that would take them to the airfield and then to Guam. Most of them bowed to Maggie as they passed, a gesture of respect she didn't know how to return. Emiko Watanabe, the youngest, pressed something into her hand before climbing into the truck. It was an origami crane folded from a scrap of paper. Delicate, perfect, impossible. Maria stood beside her watching the trucks disappear. You did it. We did it. You know they'll never thank you publicly. Can't admit they changed policy because a lieutenant broke the rules. I know. And Harrington will never forgive you. He'll make the rest of your service here as difficult as possible. I know that too. And the reprimand means you'll probably never make captain. Your career is effectively over. Maggie looked at the origami crane. I watched 40 women survive a disease that should have killed them. I prevented an epidemic. I remembered why I became a nurse in the first place. If that's what ending my career looks like, I can live with it. They walked back toward the camp in comfortable silence. Above them, the sun rose over Okinawa, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. In 3 weeks, the war would end. In 3 months, Maggie would be shipped home to Iowa. In 3 years, she'd be working in a small rural hospital, treating farmers and shopkeepers and vagrant who rode the rails, following in her father's footsteps. But in that moment, walking across a war-torn island while holding a paper crane, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, not satisfaction, just the quiet certainty that she'd made the right choice regardless of cost. Sometimes that was enough. 50 years later, in a nursing home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, an elderly woman named Margaret Sullivan would receive a letter from Japan. It came with a photograph, 40 women standing together, many with children and grandchildren. The letter, written in careful English, was signed by Keiko Matsumoto. We lived, it said. All of us. We lived. We went home. We had families. We grew old. Because you chose to see us as human when it was easier not to. Because you risked everything for people who were supposed to be your enemies. We never forgot. Our children know the story. Our grandchildren know your name. You saved 40 lives that summer in Okinawa. But you saved more than that. You saved our futures. Thank you. Maggie kept the letter in the drawer beside her bed, next to a faded origami crane. Sometimes when the days were long and memory was short, she'd take them out and remember. Remember that medicine doesn't get to hate. Remember that rules exist to serve humanity, not replace it. Remember that the hardest choice she ever made was also the simplest. She'd been a nurse. Someone was sick. That was the whole job. This story proves that one person's courage can change everything. If you want more incredible true stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Smash that like button if you believe humanity should always come before politics. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Maggie's position? Would you follow orders, or would you save those 40 women? Let's discuss. Thanks for being here.